E tangi koro ingo noa na ngā manu kōrero I rungi ngā maunga hihiri ao tāua tipuna. Kia mihi ake au ki te haukāinga I eriki ai tāua te tangata. E te amokura e maranga mai ki runga. Ora hia o patu. Kia roko hanga atu ai e tāua te pū watawata nei o te ao marama. Pūpū nei e wawau nei. Kai ngā mate, Pākehā mai, Māori mai, koutou e takoto ana I raro I te maunga tahataha o Monte Casino. Takoto mai rā koutou I roto I ngā ringaringa tō tātou kaihanga. Kei aku pāpā, kai te hoki ngā whakaaro, ki ngā kupu, a tō koutou rangatira āua tere. I muri I te whawhai nei I casino, ki ngā mōrehu I hoki waimare ki te wākainga, ki Aotearoa. Nei ngā kupu, pīkau ti atu, ngā mate me te aroha o te hokowhitu atu, ki te iwi e tangi mai rā, I ngā marae maha o te wākainga. Anā ko koutou ena, ngā mate o te hokowhitu atu. E mui koutou, te moi ngā roa, heire koutou, I tai o te ata, mo tai o te ahiahi mātou katoa, e whanatu ai. Nare rāpiti hono tātai hono, koutou te hunga mate ki a koutou. Rāpiti hono tātai hono, tātou te hunga ore ki a tātou. Ka ea, ka ea, ka ea. We're here to remember what the impact of the war in Casino had, not just on the people around here, but on our nation and other nations that fought here. And just by looking out at the sea of gravestones, almost as far as the eye can see, it speaks for itself how many lives were lost here, and we should never forget that.
"434 New Zealand soldiers lie here at the Casino Commonwealth War Cemetery, including 50 brave souls from the 28th Māori Battalion. In just 7 weeks of furious fighting here, New Zealand suffered close to 1,400 casualties. To capture Rome, the Allies planned a three-pronged attack on the so-called Gustav Line. The Kiwis, who had landed at Taranto, joined the British 8th Army to attack up the eastern coast. To the west, the American 5th Army would drive up from the south, while a seaborne American force would come ashore at Salerno and later at Anzio behind the Gustav Line. The Germans had 3 months to prepare for battle. A 40,000-strong labour force built the defensive Gustav Line, which ran along a mountain range. This is what stood between the Kiwis and their allies and the Italian capital, Rome. 13,000 soldiers made up the 2nd New Zealand Division. The Div moved as fast as it could to engage the enemy.
Roads and bridges blown up by the retreating Nazis slow down the convoy, but New Zealand engineers get them cleared or open up new routes.
The Kiwis and their allies were tasked with crossing the Sangro River, taking Castelfrentano and Ausonia before heading southwest towards Rome. Today, the scene at the Sangro is a far cry from what the New Zealand troops faced here 70 years ago. For hundreds of young men, here at the Sangro was their first taste of war.
Even though we're here at the same time of the year that the New Zealand Division was here, we don't see the snow down here, we don't see the mud, and we don't see the enemy fire that's coming on these men. So we're looking at, from the Sangro here, we're looking up at hills that are lush and green and inviting. Certainly wasn't like that when our boys are there.
Every country has something. In North Africa it was the heat, dust and flies. Here it was the mud, greasy, squelching mud and rain that was so hard to live with.
This is the Sangro River, 13,000 New Zealanders on this side of the river. This is the beginning of the Italian campaign for us. On the night of the 28th of November 1944, our boys crossed this river. There was a start line across the other side of the river. The Germans were dug in on the other side, and it took 5 days to fight from here to Castle Frontanto, about 7 kilometres from the river here. And you got to remember that more than half of the division then were new. They were reinforcements who had come across from New Zealand. This was their first taste of action, not only in Italy, but in war.
For many, their first taste of action was bloody. Over the 7 kilometres from the Sangro River to Castelfrontano, the Div lost 150 men. Eventually our troops would reach their target of Castelfrontano, but they would go no further.
This was the first town from the Sangro that the New Zealanders took, and they held this place, and then the target was Osorno. And we're right in the Gustav line here along the coast, and they got in there on 2nd December and held the place, but it was only for a day. And then the Germans came in with panzer tanks, pushed them out. And no matter how many times we tried to force our way back into that town, we couldn't take it. And in the end, we wound up being here, our soldiers, for almost 2 months, because winter set in, and it was difficult moving wheeled traffic and tanks in and out. And it was just a matter of sitting up here, holding your lines.
I think the biggest thing about the Sangro was the snow, and for the ordinary infantryman, it was hell. It really was. We got on a ridge at the top, and then we more or less stuck. We didn't have sufficient force and firepower to push the Germans aside. We were outnumbered and outgunned at that point.
Between the Sangro and Osorno, and over that close to 2-month period, there were 1,500 New Zealand casualties, a little more than 300 who were killed. So a lot of people don't realise that there were actually more men lost in terms of casualties here than the Battle of Cassino.
Monte Cassino and its towering Benedictine monastery, both beautiful and imposing, would become the centrepiece of some of the most torrid fighting of World War II. Today, the scars of war are hard to see in Cassino. But it's a town that can never forget the events that took place here 70 years ago.
Cassino is hundreds of years old, and certainly the Battle of Cassino in 1944 wasn't the first fought here over those years. Back in 1944, however, it was a population of around 19,000 people. Today it's grown, and there's about 33,000 people here today.
The Abbey stands majestically on top of Monte Cassino. The original was built over 1,500 years ago. Even before World War II, it had been destroyed and rebuilt 3 times. During World War II, both sides agreed it was to remain untouched. But it's easy to see why the Abbey became a core feature of the Gustav Line.
Strategically from here, you've got the high ground, you're looking out across the Liri Valley, which is the highway to Rome. And on the far side, you've got Cassino. So anything that moves from Cassino around this area can be seen from up here, which is why this area is so critical to hold.
To reach Rome from the south, the Allies needed to cross the Rapido Valley and then make a left hook around the bottom of Monte Cassino and enter the Leary Valley. Monte Cassino is the key, as it commands the approach across the Rapido and the entrance to the Leary. From the summit, the defenders could watch every move in either valley. They could direct their artillery and mortar fire from the lower slopes and from their guns hidden in the jagged hills. On the 17th of January 1944, before the Kiwis arrived, the Americans, with the support of the British and French troops, began the first attack at Cassino. After 2.5 weeks of fighting, the US troops suffered some 2,200 casualties and were withdrawn. They were replaced by the New Zealand Corps under the command of Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg. Soon it was time for the second battle for Monte Cassino. This time, it was the turn of the New Zealanders to lead the charge. Before the battle on the ground could be resumed, a highly controversial decision was made: to destroy the monastery. What was once a saintly structure had now become a demoralizing symbol of German dominance.
It's imposing, it's daunting, and to know that in daylight at least, any move you make is going to be seen from up there. It had a huge psychological impact on these guys down here. They felt that despite it being a monastery sitting on top, they needed to bomb it for their peace of mind. But I would have hated to have been here myself, you know, looking at that above you.
The bombing was far from perfect. The American bombers arrived 2 days before the ground forces were ready to attack. More than 200 civilians who had sought shelter inside the abbey were killed. Hundreds more civilians and Allied troops were also killed as a result of wayward bombing.
We were lucky, we missed. But they clobbered one of our other platoons, and they clobbered the French. They really did the French over, and we couldn't see why. It was a gorgeous day, and there was the mountain, there was the river. One of those inexplicable businesses that the Americans were working to a different agenda.
With the abbey destroyed, the second battle for Monte Cassino could now be launched by the New Zealand force that included Indian and Gurkha troops. Here was the plan. The Indian troops were tasked with capturing the monastery and then would head down to cut off the road called Route 6. Meanwhile, 2 companies of the 28th Māori Battalion were to fight their way across the Rapido River. B Company would take the railway station and nearby buildings. They would then head some 300 metres towards the southern end of the town to capture a small group of houses, a total distance of just 800 metres. A Company would go left and take a land feature called the Hummock, only 400 metres from the start line. Meanwhile, the New Zealand engineers would patch up the bombed-out railway embankment, allowing the passage of 300 American tanks with supporting artillery and infantry. This force would come up past the railway station to a point just south of Route 6. All of this had to be achieved under the cover of darkness. The tanks and infantry would then wheel south and mop up pockets of enemy resistance. This would then enable new routes of advance to be opened up. Along the way, they would cut through the German defences that stretched across a line halfway up the valley. All this in a day's work. While this was the plan, what would actually unfold would result in catastrophic losses for the Allies. This is what happened. At dusk on the 17th of February 1944, after 2 days of intense bombing, with the Abbey destroyed, the Allied artillery opened fire with 500 guns. Soon after, the job of the Māori Battalion's A and B companies would begin. A total of 200 men were to cross here at the Rapido River to capture the railway station and the surrounding area, allowing the tanks and support infantry to advance along this causeway into the Leary Valley and on to Rome.
We're standing here right on the start line for the attack on the station. Our men had to cross this river in flood, so many of them were up to their waist. It's a lot shallower today, but it was the winter period, and so that they started the line pretty well drenched, cold, and although it's 500 metres to the railway station from here, it was mined, it was wired, and there were guns everywhere, and it was pitch black. And so there was confusion as they went into it. So they had a tremendous task ahead of them.
The artillery had spent 2 hours softening up the German defences. Now came the Māori Battalion. Captain Monty Wikirifi led the 28th Battalion's B Company, which had the job of taking the railway station. Major James Henare led A Company, which would take the area around the hummock. At 9:30 p.m, A and B companies formed up side by side. The 200 men marched in the dark, seeking as much cover as they could up to the Rapido River. The problems were soon evident. The approaches were flooded, it was dark, it was wet, it was muddy. Extremely heavy going for the men just to get to the river. They were soon up to their necks in very cold water, and it would only get worse. The Māori now found themselves in a minefield. They were under attack from mortar and machine gun fire from the lower slopes of Monte Cassino and the southern edge of the town. B Company suffered badly on the minefields. Those who could still fight took an hour to reach the entrance of the station yards, an hour to advance just 150 metres. Then flares went up. The men could now see that the yards were protected by wire and 2 machine guns, which opened fire. 2 B Company men threw themselves on the coiled wire. Others charged over and went to work with bayonets and grenades. The machine gun posts were soon cleared out, and by midnight, B Company had control of the station. Today, the Casino train station stands in the same position where B Company fought so valiantly 70 years ago. It's hard to picture the conditions that faced the men who fought here.
When I walk in here, I almost feel the spirit of what went on here, and look out at the station yard and can see those men who were killed there still lying out on the in the rail yard. That's, I guess, one of the downsides of knowing too much history, that you see not today, but you see the past.
It was now time for B Company to advance on the small group of houses at the southern end of the town, which were strongly defended by machine guns. B Company suffered more losses and took shelter back in the station. A Company had now begun its attack on the hummock, but it was more heavily defended than first thought. In front was another swollen stream, 7 meters wide and surrounded by wire and mines. Accurate machine guns sat on top. Men went down. In the confusion of the night and enemy fire, the survivors of A Company were scattered and fell back to the railway station, seeking cover in order to survive.
Well, if the tanks didn't make it, you would have hoped that they would have been pulled out before the sun rose. Worst case scenario is the sun rises and you're still down here and there are no tanks. There's no way home in the daylight. You've got to hang on in here. And that's exactly what happened. The engineers, unfortunately, couldn't complete the road and no tanks came at 6 o'clock in the morning. So imagine these guys sitting in here after fighting all night, can't hear any tanks coming, the sun's come up, you can see everything that's going from Monte Cassino, everything that's moving. They can't come out of this building, the destroyed building it was then, and there's no way home. You just got to sit it out.
With the sun now up, the Germans counterattacked with 2 tanks and infantry, but were soon taken out by Allied artillery. A blanket of smoke was created by some 9,000 rounds of smoke canisters sent up from the rear. This was because the Māori were ordered to stay where they were, to hold their positions until nightfall, still some 12 hours away, when the tanks could reach them. But the smoke also meant their own supporting artillery was less accurate, taking the pressure off the Germans. The Māori were under incessant fire, and even when they asked for thicker smoke, it was quickly blown away by a brisk southerly wind. In the middle of the day, the Māori Battalion headquarters dispatched a platoon from C Company, some 24 men. They had hardly crossed the Rapido River before 12 men were lost in a hail of fire. None reached the station. Stretcher bearers coming back from the station also suffered casualties.
We knew they needed assistance when we put in our first assault, but we didn't know where they were. And this was a very frustrating state. We could have done a hell of a lot to have helped, but the communications just broke down completely.
Mid-afternoon, the Germans launched another counterattack. Infantry along the railway track from the southwest and tanks from the town. The Māori were helpless. The foremost platoon of B Company was overrun. The remaining survivors of A and B companies struggled back across the Rapido under heavy fire, suffering further losses.
The great story is Monty Wikerefi's story, who was the commander of B Company. His legs were blown up and he faked that he was dead when the Germans came out and checked the bodies, and he waited till dark and then he began, using 2 sticks, crawling back down the railway line in the dark. 24 hours later he reached his lines, and that was a fascinating feat of endurance which inspired a lot of the men, given the tragedy of what happened to the Māori Battalion up here. "200 men came up the night before, 66 made it back the next day."
As for the Indian troops, they had as little success as the Māori and were badly beaten up on the hill, losing some 400 men.
Well, if it had to come off, the whole story of the Battle of Cassino might well have changed, and it was a gamble. Certainly the Māori commanders at the time thought that it was a 50-50 chance of being pulled off, and even the Freiburg and the higher command knew it probably wasn't much better than that. They did their best, and it's easy to criticise in hindsight. There were a lot of lives lost by leaving the guys at the station that day, but who knows if we were in that position, whether we would have made a decision that was any different from what Freiburg did.
More appalling weather saw a whole month pass before the third battle could take place at Cassino.
By trying to take out the railway station, it was to cut off this township and go up the Liri Valley. When that didn't work, they reverted back to, well, let's just smash the place and get in there and take it.
The plan was for an aerial bombardment of the town to commence at 8:30 a.m. and last until noon. 500 bombers would drop 1,000 tons of high explosives. At midday, the artillery situated to the southeast would commence a creeping barrage. This meant rolling out a carpet of shells covering 100 yards every 10 minutes. 5 tons of high explosives would fall on every single German thought to be in the township. Minutes later, the men of the New Zealand 25th Battalion would advance into the town behind the shelling, again making 100 yards every 10 minutes. They would be supported by some 16 tanks. The 26th Battalion would also advance. Along the way, they would capture Castle Hill and would reach the Continental Hotel at the corner of Route 6 by 2 o'clock. The next phase, to commence mid-afternoon, would see the 25th followed by the 24th and 26th Battalions continue southward from Route 6, clearing the rest of the town and establishing a bridgehead at the Baron's Palace Junction. So by nightfall, they would have control of the town, the railway station, the railway crossing over the river, and the roundhouse and the hummock, all in a day's work. The next morning, 300 tanks with artillery and infantry would come up to the town and move into the Leary Valley. The whole operation would take just 2 days. In theory, the plan handed down from General Freyberg and the High Command may have appeared sound, but what would unfold would expose its many flaws. On the morning of March the 15th, the aerial bombing commenced at 8:30 on the dot. Not a single building was left intact. Upper stories collapsed over ground floors and basements, toppling down bricks and mortar. Cratered and buried under mounds of debris, streets lost their identity in a wilderness of rubble. Parks and open spaces became a waste of torn earth and uprooted trees.
The bombing of the town, we didn't quite see why a lot of it had been done, because the town was turned into a gigantic heap of rubble. And that stopped their own tanks.
When the tanks first came in here, they expected to be going down formed roads of some kind. But when they saw the first huge craters in the middle of the roads, they realized they couldn't get past. Without bulldozers filling those holes or clearing the rubble, the tanks were useless. And the soldiers who were going in with those tanks supporting them were left on their own, and communication broke down pretty quickly. Radio sets with the rain and getting damp didn't work. And all of a sudden, you know, men were lost in little sections all over the place.
And if the Allies thought no one could have survived the bombing, they were in for a rude shock. The Germans had taken cover in natural caves and cellars, while Casino Town was levelled by the bombing.
Behind the Hotel Continental there was a cave, and certainly the Germans used it as their headquarters during the bombing, and over 100 men were in there just watching the bombing. And when it was over, they just came out back into the rubble of the Hotel Continental, and that's where they set up their headquarters and were able to fire on men moving through. So I guess for the guys coming through and being so much fire coming from that Hotel Continental, they would have been surprised. Where's it coming from, and how come these guys are all still alive after all that bombing?
Nothing went right for the Kiwis. Their radios failed, runners couldn't get messages through, and the foot soldiers couldn't communicate with the tanks.
I think once it was total, they thought they'd be able to almost walk through here. Certainly wasn't the case. When in the end we had 6 battalions in here of infantrymen, and we had 50 tanks stuck in here, just pouring them in day by day, just trying to strengthen the numbers in here, but they just weren't able to wrestle parts of Casino out of the hands of the Germans.
They had to keep working through the town, making their way over and through the rubble and across craters 20 metres wide. The German paratroopers proved to be tough opponents. The terms of combat were now in their favour, at close quarters and at hand grenade range.
She was really rugged in here. I mean, the fighting was across streets. Sometimes it was in the same buildings where the Kiwis would discover that the Germans were either in the basement or in a room next door to them. There was one incident where a Māori soldier found a hole in one of the buildings. He went down it and there was a stairway and he found down there Germans hiding out and a tank, a Panzer tank down there. He came back up and told his officer. They went down with guns and they brought out 50 Germans who had been down there for about 3 or 4 days. And they said the stench in there, because there were dead Germans as well who had bodies had ballooned out, that these guys were living with, prepared to live down there and under those circumstances. That's how tough they were.
After days of fighting, the Kiwis were battered and bogged down, and nowhere close to capturing the town. But there was some light on an otherwise gloomy battlefield. Apart from the impassable debris, perhaps the greatest obstacle was the domination of the town afforded by Castle Hill, which was heavily defended by the Germans. The New Zealand 25th Battalion's D Company, led by Major Stan Hewitt, was given the tough job of taking it. The men came off the road behind the school. They split into two, the bulk of them making their way round the foot of the hill. 16 platoon worked their way up the hill, behind the castle. The men then scaled an almost vertical cliff, and with machine guns and hand grenades captured more than 20 Germans. Meanwhile, the rest of D Company fought its way round to the rear of the castle, and by 5 o'clock they had taken it. 3 more days of rugged battle were to follow before very early on the 19th, the Germans took the offensive. Supported by troops in the town, the Germans came down from the monastery and took back Castle Hill. The fighting had been so brutal and bloody that in a scene reminiscent of World War I, a 30-minute truce was called to retrieve the wounded. Amidst all this action, there was no hope of an infantry attack on the monastery. After 10 days of furious fighting, the unsuccessful New Zealand Corps was withdrawn from battle. A month later, in May, after another massive effort by the Allies, Monte Cassino was finally taken. The honour of capturing the monastery went to Polish troops. After 4 major offensives involving troops from around a dozen Allied countries, the Battle of Monte Cassino had finally come to an end. The total cost to both sides would be 75,000 men dead or wounded. With Cassino finally falling to the Allies, the weakened Germans retreated north. The war in Italy could have soon ended, but one flawed decision would ensure that thousands more men would die, including New Zealand soldiers. As the Germans fell back from Cassino, the Americans were ordered to cut them off north of the Gustav Line. But the American commander, Mark Clark, wanted the glory of being the first Allied leader into Rome. He ignored his orders, allowing the Germans to create the Gothic Line. This would have deadly consequences. In the first week of June, Mark Clark and his 5th Army entered Rome, arriving to a hero's welcome. The New Zealand Division arrived a few days later. By now, they had been in Italy for 9 arduous months. While the Kiwis took time off for a few weeks' rest, the Germans were withdrawing many of their troops from Italy altogether in response to the D-Day landings in northern France. In July, the New Zealand troops began another journey that would involve hundreds of kilometres, months of hard slog in all weathers, and the loss of several hundred more men in some of the bloodiest fighting of the war. The Kiwis travelled north, past Lake Trasimene, to join the battle just south of Florence. The region of Tuscany is famous for producing some of the world's best wine. In 1944, it would be the place the New Zealand Div would re-engage with tiring Germans, who had adopted a new battle plan.
The Germans were adopting a strategy of an aggressive retreat whereby they were trying to slow up the Allied advance while they strengthened the Gothic line. And so that every hill and every valley had to be fought for inch by inch. It took them 3 weeks to get from here to Florence. It's not that far, but because they were fighting for the ground, it was a slow advance.
If you have a look at the casualty lists, they were still terribly big. And there were more lives lost on the road to Florence than there were at Cassino.
During the push to Florence, New Zealand and Allied soldiers drove the Germans out of many small towns and villages, at great cost. In the township of Tavanale, 44 New Zealand soldiers were killed in battle, many from the 28th Māori Battalion. Even so, locals in this region were confused as to just who these dark-skinned warriors were that had helped liberate their towns.
When did you find out that Māori soldiers liberated Tavanale?
15 years ago, because before the people believe that American soldier, black American soldier liberated Tavanale, because you remember blackface, and they believe that it was American soldier. But we began to study the history in near 2000, and we found that not American soldier, but New Zealand soldier.
So what do the people think of New Zealanders today?
A good opinion, yeah. After 15 years that we study, we make a book, we meet a New Zealand soldier and veteran, now is a very good opinion.
One person who remembers the day the New Zealand soldiers came to town is Rosanna Tachi. She was just 10 years old when the Kiwi soldiers liberated her home of San Cassiano, which had been all but destroyed by the Germans.
Quando una splendida giornata di sole sentimmo un urlo, stanno arrivando gli alleati, arrivano, e tutti corremmo fuori a vedere. Poi a me bambina la cosa che mi colpì più di tutto furono alcuni soldati di pelle più scura che io all'epoca non avevo mai visto. E le dirò che mi colpirono e pensai, come sono belli. Tutti cominciarono a dire, ma chi sono, che corpo sono? Qualcuno cominciò a dire, sono inglesi, no, non sono inglesi. Poi ci fu qualcuno che disse, ma saranno Maori. E quindi entrò la voce Maori e neozelandesi.
How did the soldiers treat you?
Trovammo subito una grande corrispondenza. Cominciarono a darci la cioccolata e poi cominciarono a darci le scatolette. Io l'unica femmina, tendevo il grembiulino e mi mettevano la roba dentro. E fu un periodo molto bello e lo ricordo con grande gioia. I Maori mi sono rimasti nel cuore e da grande, da adulta, ho sempre ricordato, lo dicevo prima, mi sono sempre ricordata di queste due mani, la mano di una bambina la mano di un soldato che si univano in questo gesto di amore. Anche nella guerra c'era un qualcosa di umanità che non si distruggeva.
If the New Zealand soldiers brought hope for the Italian people, the Germans brought terror, turning their guns on civilians, massacring thousands of innocent men, women and children. Local historian Stefano Fusi claims more than 10,000 civilians were massacred during the Italian campaign. In Tuscany, 300 were slaughtered. He takes us to a site where one of those massacres took place, just 1 hour before the New Zealand troops arrived.
This is the place where the German soldier bring the 12 farmers and shoot here in this place. 1 hour before the German gone, before liberation. Men from for family.
Why did they shoot them?
Why? Because German soldiers spread terror in the civilian people because civilian people help the Allied soldiers.
These are the faces of the murdered men. Under orders from the High Command, German troops massacred civilians in order to quash partisan uprisings. 70 years on, and Stefano Fusi is on a quest to find out just who murdered the 12 innocent men here.
So why is it important to know who did this?
It's important for the family, it's important for justice.
Early in August, after a month of bitter fighting, the Kiwi Division rolls on to Florence. Along dusty roads and lanes, bathed in Italian sunshine, go the Bren carriers of the Māori Battalion and Kiwi tanks.
After several weeks of fierce fighting on the outskirts of Florence, the Germans abandoned the city.
Then come New Zealanders. Wild enthusiasm greets the Allies. Men, women and children pour into the streets to wave, cheer and throw flowers.
Today, Florence stands almost unmarked by the war.
Florence is beautiful. Clearly, it's the artistic, cultural centre of northern Italy, and you can appreciate why neither side wanted really to fight in Florence if they could help it, to preserve, you know, these beautiful treasures. And I'm sure the men, when they were on leave here after Florence fell, had the same appreciation of Italian culture when they went through Florence.
Florence provided the New Zealand Division with another opportunity to rest and to take in the sights of the historic city.
The German commander Kesselring had a penchant for art, and he didn't want to fight in the city, didn't want it destroyed. And the Allies got across that side and the Germans were on this side, and they withdrew and left the city to them. The only thing that Kesselring did do is he destroyed all the bridges, barring the Ponte Vecchio, which is behind us. And because he had learnt from Rome by leaving all the bridges up, that he was giving his enemy an advantage, saving the bridge and protecting the culture of the Italians, while issuing an order that civilians were fair game and that they executed them as they withdrew is the big irony here.
It was soon time to fight again. The assault on and over the Gothic line saw our troops head east to fight at Rimini and then on to Faenza.
The New Zealanders zigzagged their way up Italy in a confusion of battles and skirmishes. They were able to revert to their role of pursuit until Faenza, where they were again held up by a strong German stand in the city.
As the New Zealand division began fighting in Faenza, the German forces were continuing to weaken. Eventually, the enemy would abandon the city and fall back to the Senio River, where they would hunker down for a long, hard winter.
The Germans were absolutely stubborn. They had been told to hold, and they held. They were magnificent troops. The pressure did not ease.
Faenza would become home for those not on the front line. Massimo Valli was a young boy when the New Zealand troops moved in. And for 3 months, the Māori Battalion became his neighbours.
Dietro di noi c'era l'alloggio di 2 compagnie del battaglione Māori. Compagnia D. D Company, C Company. Io abitavo in quella casa lì. Venivo, perché ero sempre in giro. Quando loro ormai mi conoscevano, mi chiamavano, io venivo, stavo lì con loro, mi facevano vedere delle cose, loro mi facevano vedere, e così, ma quasi tutti i giorni, quasi. Bene, perché mi davano cioccolate e caramelle, io pensavo benissimo, E alcuni di loro avevano la chitarra, e suonavano la chitarra. Suonavano anche canzoni italiane, come Mamma e come Campagnola Bella.
When the soldiers left here, did you miss them?
Sì, molto mi è dispiaciuto, molto, perché erano buoni soldati, erano buone persone. Dopo sono arrivati i polacchi.
If the men weren't in Faenza, they were here on the front line at the Senio River. This memorial at the river pays tribute to the Kiwi liberators who lost their lives here.
You know, a lot of people who come to Italy because of World War II, they tend to think of Cassino as the big battle of Italy, and everything else after that is minor. What do you say to that?
Yeah, in the war, Cassino seems that the Italian campaign finished after Cassino in May 1944, but the war lasted another year, and the Allied suffered high losses. For example, from Ancona to Bologna, and that are about 250 kilometers, we can find in the military cemeteries 12,000 dead.
One of those 12,000 men who lost his life here was Monty Suta's uncle, Second Lieutenant Sam Paniora, whose body now rests here at the Forley Cemetery.
When the war started, he was at high school, Gisborne Boys. He enlisted at 17, and he was 21 when he was killed. I was told he was a good singer. His grandfather taught him how to box so he could handle himself. He was happy-go-lucky, devil-may-care. Back in those days, you know, all the young boys watched all the cowboys and Indian movies, and I was told by one of his men that he found him down in the basement of a villa here one day with a mirror practicing his draw with his revolver, and he told the man who had seen him, "Hey, don't tell the boys that I'm doing this," but you know, they were very young, they were boys.
Sam Paniora fought at the Sangro, Cassino and Florence, and each time was wounded in battle, only to be killed on the outskirts of Faenza just one day before the Germans' retreat.
When the news of his death came through, a lot of people were affected by it. My mother always had a dream of coming here to see her brother's grave because her mother had passed it on to her. But in those days, you know, travel overseas for Māori was limited. So when I come here, it's, you know, it's not just me. I'm not just thinking of my uncle, but I think of my own mother and her mother and all the members of our family who, you know, have always wanted to come here.
It was here that Monty's Uncle Sam and several other members of his extended whānau fought their last battle.
So where we are now, this is where my uncle got killed in December 1944, in the house that used to stand here. And if you look back down there, a couple of 100 meters down there in the dark, that was the start line on the night of the attack. And it was called Ruatoria because all the men who were in his platoon were generally from that area. And they were tasked with trying to take this house across here, Della Cura. And they were observing Della Cura. They knew there were Germans over there. And in the early hours of the morning, some Germans walked across. The uncle shot them. And once the Germans realized there were enemy forces in this house, a Tiger tank came around and began blowing the walls off the top floor of the house that stood here. He had the door ajar as he observed what was going on over there, and by that time a sniper was lying in the grass and shot him just below the helmet and got him through the forehead. Yeah, well, I think, you know, 21-year-old guy, full of life, I guess. And have it taken from me so young.
After a long winter on the banks of the Senio River, the New Zealanders crossed the River Po on Anzac Day 1945, reaching Padua 3 days later. Then a mad dash saw them reach Trieste just 4 days after that. On the 2nd of May 1945, General Freyberg and his victorious New Zealand division entered Trieste. The battered German forces surrendered unconditionally, the Italian theatre of war finally ending. The war in the so-called soft underbelly of Europe came at the cost of more than 900,000 souls, including the deaths of over 300,000 Allied soldiers. New Zealand lost more than 2,000 men, 230 from the 28th Māori Battalion.
Mm-hmm.